All right, so starting off with authoritarianism. James Loxton, in his brief introduction to the concept, wrote that it is a broad umbrella term for non democratic systems of government. Hans-Joachim, a professor of political science at the University of Würzburg in Germany, observed that authoritarian regimes do not maintain the institutions and procedures of participation and political competition, fundamental rights, and control of power, by which he means separation of powers, parliaments, elections, plurality of parties, etc. These systems can take several forms. They can be led by individual military leaders or a military committee, which we usually call a junta, a single dominant political party, a dictator or central committee, or even a religious leader. The I'm recording this just several days after the attack on Iran and the killing of um, how many, right? But there's the clerics are trying to meet, so they're trying to keep that form of authoritarianism alive. Likewise, authoritarian governments can come to power in several ways: through armed revolution or through legal means like elections and legal appointment. Adolf Hitler, for example, was appointed Chancellor of Germany by then President Paul von Hindenburg, in January of 1933, after being elected legally to the parliament, to the Reichstag, the German parliament. The appointment, of course, was a result of a lot of political wrangling in the proverbial back rooms, but that does not take away from the fact that Hitler came to power through legal means. Um, by contrast, Generalissimo Francisco Franco came to power in Spain after the Civil War in 1939. It seems to me that in earlier times, monarchies could also be considered authoritarian, with inheritance as a path to power. While it's not very common in the world today, we do see this playing out in the Kim family in North Korea. So, a significant figure in the understanding of authoritarian governments is the political scientist Juan Linz. He was born in Germany in 1926 to a German father and a Spanish mother. In 1932, his mother moved back to Spain and took her son with her, excuse me. So he experienced authoritarianism firsthand under the Franco regime, which incidentally lasted until 1975. Linz defined authoritarianism in 1964 as follows: they are political systems with limited political pluralism, without elaborate and guiding ideology, but with distinctive mentalities, without extensive or intensive political mobilization, except at some points in their development, and in which a leader, or occasionally a small group, exercises power within formally ill defined limits, but actually quite predictable ones. So let's consider some of these points from Linz. Political pluralism refers to the recognition of different populations within the geographical area of the state, along with an affordance of political power, of participation in the government. Apartheid era South Africa, for example, had limited political pluralism because the whites in power tried to keep the black majority out of sight as much as possible, and they denied them political power. I think this is an interesting point to keep in mind because this concept of power was one that um, both Elon Musk and Peter Thiel learned as privileged sons in South Africa. Secondly, Linz's observation about limited and poorly articulated ideology with the presence of distinctive mentalities is really significant. This means that authoritarian governments do not rely on meaningful principles other than increasing their own power and, in most cases, their own wealth. Mentalities, psychological states, and emotional states are far more important because authoritarians try to gather and maintain power through emotion much more than through well reasoned logical principles and arguments. So um, let's look at Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, really quickly. Um, he wrote, um, kind of wrote about this um, distinctive mentality with pride. Fascism, he wrote, was not the nursling of a doctrine previously drafted at a desk. It was born of need of action, and it was action. It was not a party, but in the first 2 years, an anti party and a movement. Furthermore, he wrote that prior to the 1922 March on Rome, which led to his being given power by King Victor Emmanuel III, quote, the need for action forbade delay and careful doctrinal elaborations. They, there were discussions, but there was something more sacred and more important, end quote, by which he meant fighting and dying in the streets. Fascists knew how to die, he claimed. By his own admission, Mussolini boasted that fascism did not emerge from elaborate or guiding ideology, but from action, fighting, and death. So, another significant example here is Nazi Germany and anti Semitism. Hitler used anti Semitism to whip up anger and support, even though anti Semitism was and still is a kind of vague historical concept rooted in hate. It's a very malleable term, and Hitler used that to his advantage. It's important to understand that Hitler's anti-Semitism in his book Mein Kampf, and for much of the Nazi regime, consisted of scapegoating the Jews and wanting to create distance between them and the German folk. This campaign of blame was calculated to stoke fear and rage, and it was brutally successful. The persecution of the Jews, including the creation of ghettos and concentration camps, was initially a measure to create segregation between the Jews and the German populations and to push Jews to leave the Reich. Um, the fact that many died under those measures was an acceptable and even a desired outcome, but it was not the goal. The object of eliminating the Jews developed over time and wasn't formalized until the Wannsee Conference near Berlin in uh, January 1942. So 3 years after the war began and 3 years before the end of the war. Hitler had been in power since 1933. Thus, Nazi anti Semitism was a vague principle of action that produced distinctive mentalities and emotional states, but it was not an articulated political doctrine. Number three, the concept of mobilization or lack of it is significant. Authoritarian governments don't want citizens to be particularly concerned with public or state affairs. In contrast to totalitarian governments like Soviet and Chinese communism, who want uh, who wanted and a very engaged citizenry to advance the vision of the state. Authoritarian regimes, on the other hand, want citizens to focus on their private lives or on the lives of their neighbors to report them. We'll talk a little bit about surveillance in a different video. Authoritarians do not even want the possibility of citizen interference with their machinations. Locke's Loxton, put it this way: if totalitarianism is for joiners, authoritarianism is for the apathetic. Lastly, Linz's point about ill-defined but predictable limits on power can refer to limits like economic realities, religious or cultural factors, international law, and relations, etc. Um, for example, dictatorships in smaller countries, um, their power is limited by their economic realities. You know, oftentimes they're very limited because they're not great economic engines. They can exert a lot of control over their own population, but they can't exert a lot of control elsewhere. Another example, coming back to Iran, is it is to some degree limited by traditions and teachings associated with Islamic law. But it's important to note that the Iranian interpretation of Islamic law is not universal. There are many Muslim critics of the Iranian regime whose critiques are rooted in their Islamic faith. However, the Iranian state is predictably authoritarian and brutal. One other point from Linz, he claimed that democratic governments must have three elements. One, universal adult suffrage. All adult citizens must be able to vote. Number two, free, fair, and competitive elections. Citizens must have real choices between candidates, and each candidate must not be hindered by government by other government actions. Number three, protection of civil liberties. Loxton points out that the freedoms of speech, association, and assembly are especially important to democratic regimes. Any government that efforts to curtail any of these elements indicate that they have taken an authoritarian turn.